One of the things that we as human beings, as Christians, deal with is what is right and what is wrong. What should you do in this situation or not do in this situation? And sometimes there's so many rules that start to happen that all of a sudden you feel as if your head is about to explode, right? I know all the students know what I'm talking about. And all the teachers probably know what I'm talking about, because on Tuesday when all the kids showed up, there was rules. And you do this, you don't do this, you ask for this, and otherwise you're going to be in big trouble. And so you as a student are like, okay, I got to get these down, hopefully. When I went to Malawi, I figured out that there's a lot of things that we may do here that you should not do in Malawi. And so I tried to live according to that. You know, I was talking to Ben Hayes. He said, all right, one of these things you need to do when you're preaching to people in Malawi, make sure that you don't do this. Now, how many of y'all walk around and talk with your hands in your pockets? A lot of us do, don't we? It's common. He said, you don't do that because it's a sign of disrespect. And he told me how he figured this out. He was speaking in Malawi one day, and he was introducing his father, Kirk, which is a good guy. And as he's introducing his father, Kirk, he's got one hand in his pants here, in his pocket, and he's pointing to his dad, and his dad comes up, and immediately Simon comes up and says, I just want y'all to know, Ben really does love his father. And Ben's like, why'd you say that? I'll tell you later. And then Simon told him why. And he's like, oh. And so Ben told me this. And so I'm like, hey, Ben, I don't have a problem with that. I do not talk with my hands in my pockets. He's like, okay, all right. And so I'm up there preaching to the village there and going through my sermon. And I'm in a really good part. We're having the translation going back and forth. And I realize my hands are in my pockets. So I've got a conundrum. Because I'm sitting here, I'm speaking, but I'm right behind the Lord's table. So I think that it's blocking whatever they might be seeing. So I'm hunching a little bit as I'm speaking. And I want to try to get my hands out of my pockets so that no one sees that they're in their pockets, because I don't want them to be disrespected. And so I'm very carefully trying to take my hands out of my pockets. And I think I do pretty good. And so I start speaking again. And then just a few minutes later, I realize, oh no, my hands are back in my pockets. And I'm like, oh gosh. And so I just keep my hands up here as I'm speaking to the people. I don't even put my hands down there for the rest of the time. But the point is, we go into these other cultures and we realize there's things that we may do here that you shouldn't do there, right? You know, to give you another example, in Malawi, you're not supposed to lose control. By that I mean emotional control. Like, for example, if you're talking to somebody, you don't want to lose your cool, right? You don't want to get too excited. You don't want to get too mad. You don't want to start crying. You don't even want to really laugh too loudly or uncontrollably, because to be doing that is seen as childish. Okay? So, if I could just borrow, where'd she go? Lily, would you come up here? I want to borrow you real quick. All right, so some of y'all have seen this, but I'm going to show you real quick because you remember the story I told you last week where I asked them about the handshake? Okay, and they told me about the handshake. As a sign of gratitude for them telling me about the handshake, I showed them our handshake. So here we go. So this is what I showed them. I showed this to Moses, and I showed this to Matthias. Some of y'all have seen this. Here we go. Are you ready? I'm sorry. I keep like, oop, okay, here we go. Oh, you missed. Okay, we got to do it again. Here we go. All right, here we go. All right, thank you very much. Round of applause. There we go. All right, so now, there's a reason for why I'm telling you this. As I'm showing this to Moses and to Matthias, they are just laughing. I mean, they think that's funny. When you get to this part, they're just dying. They're like, oh, man, that's hilarious. And then up comes Simon, the elder, the administrator of the whole thing. And I'm like, do you want me to show Simon? They're like, yes. And so I say, Simon, here we go. And I show it to him. Pop, 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 pop. And they're laughing, and I'm like, and he just looks at me. And he looks over at Matthias. He says, I came to speak to you. And I'm like, whoa. He didn't even crack a smile or nothing. It wasn't because he didn't think it funny. I think he thought it was funny in my heart. They have to be very careful not to lose their cool. I think he struggled. So, one of the things is we have to be careful about all these rules. And laws are interesting because it's hard to figure out all the rules that we need to follow sometimes, but we need to understand something, that not only did Jesus' death and resurrection free us from sin or free us from guilt, but Paul tells us that it freed us in another way. He says, we have been released from the law so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit, not in the old way of the written code. Okay? So today, as we look here at Luke chapter 6, I hope you see how Christ frees us from a different kind of slavery, and that in essence He frees you to be who you were meant to be, to free you to be the image of God, to free you to be good. Okay? All right. Okay, here we go. Luke chapter 6. Here we go. Now, right before we start this, I need to get my Bible in the right place. What am I doing? There we go. Luke chapter 6. Now, but right before we look at it, we're not going to reread it, but right before we look at it, let me just give you a little context, okay? It's very important. All right, so the Bible tells us that creation happened over how many days? Anybody? Yep. 7 days, 6 days creation, 7th day was resting, right? Okay, so we hear about this in Genesis, that creation happened over a 6-day period. And one of the things that I am guilty of, I have said this, that creation culminates with the creation of mankind. But that's not really true. It culminates, it comes to the point at day 7 when God looks and He sees everything's good and He rests in it. And it's good. And He enjoys it. And it continues. Now we see in Exodus chapter 20, you can look at that yourself later in what's called the Decalogue. We also call this the 10 Commandments, that God instituted the Sabbath to keep it holy, for people not to work. And when He did this, you need to understand, He did it because He wanted people to rest. And He wanted to give them a blessing. He wanted to give them a gift. Now we all rest in different ways. Some of you rest in fishing, some of you rest in actual working, some of us rest in different ways, but they were very specific about this. They didn't want people to work. They wanted to enjoy the blessing that God had after He created everything, that Adam and Eve even had after He created everything, that they all were living in the Garden of Eden, walking together, talking together, loving each other, and resting, okay? Until the fall happened. And it broke it, and it fractured it. And so the gift of the Sabbath to God's people was to recreate for one day the kind of rest God and Adam and Eve had after creation. And it served as a sign to everybody that they belonged to God. But something happened. You know, mankind, I'm going to tell you, God made us in His image. We often don't act like we're in His image. Often the things we touch turn bad. And the Sabbath was no different. Over time, the Sabbath changed from a day of rest meant to bless mankind into something very different, because hundreds of years before Jesus was even born, religious leaders, rabbinic religious leaders, added their own rules and traditions to keeping the Sabbath. 39 rules. And they had all these explanations for each one of these, so that these people would make sure that if you're going to rest, this is how you rest. Talk about keeping rules straight. They had a whole bunch of them. And so that's where we're at. at the beginning of chapter 6, verse 1. On the Sabbath, Jesus and the disciples are walking through a field, and they're hungry, and they start to obey the book of Deuteronomy, where it says, as long as you don't use a tool, you can just grab it with your hand, and you can break it up, and you can eat it. And they do this, and a Pharisee sees them, and look what the Pharisee says. He says, "Why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" Immediately, he's nitpicking. Now, you need to understand something, that Pharisees, at the beginning of the creation of this order, I do believe had good intentions and truly loved God, but they lost their way. There was once a preacher who was looking through the yellow pages in, I think it was Atlanta, several years ago, and he looks and he sees that there's, under these restaurants, there's a name of a restaurant that's called the Church of God Grill. He's like, that's weird. So he calls a restaurant, and the guy answers, says, "Hello, Church of God Grill." He says, "How in the world did you come up with that name?" He said, "Well, it's a long story, but to shrink it down," he said, "this used to be a mission. And we started selling chicken dinners in the back on Sunday to help fund the mission. Well, people liked the chicken so much that we had such a good business that, eventually we just cut back on the church service. And after a while, we just closed down the church altogether, and we just kept serving the chicken dinners. And we kept the name we started with. People knew that, and so we call ourselves Church of God Grill." Do you think they lost their way? Forgot what the mission was supposed to be? I think the Pharisees did. They lost their way with nitpicking, and I think sometimes we do. I think we lose our way in nitpicking. Jesus responds in two ways. He justifies himself in two ways. Number one, he quotes Scripture. He refers to David. He talks about how David, he was hungry, his followers were hungry, and they needed to eat. And so they took the bread of the presence, something that they weren't supposed to eat, and they ate it. Nobody gave him a hard time because he's King David. It was good. He took care of their needs. But then he says the even better thing. The Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. He had said this previously in the previous chapter where he says the Son of Man has the authority to forgive sins. And then he healed the man lowered through the roof. And we see right here, he's basically using it in the same way, showing that he has the authority to say what's lawful to do on the Sabbath. And then we skip to another Sabbath, in which Jesus is preaching in the synagogue. And the Pharisees, they're there, the teachers of the law, they're there, but they're there for a different reason. They're not there to worship God. They're there to accuse Jesus. They're hoping he's going to heal somebody so that they can accuse him of doing something wrong. They've got those 39 laws on the Sabbath ready to go. And Jesus knows their thoughts, knows what they're thinking, and calls forward a man who's got a shriveled hand. And the man obeys and stands up in front of everyone. And Jesus says to the crowd, "I ask you," verse 9, "which is lawful on the Sabbath?" Now, if we just stop there, I think the Pharisees would have been so ready to enlighten him. That is until he continues. He says, "To do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it. To do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy it." And they remain quiet, and Jesus then tells the man to stretch out his hand. And as he stretches, he doesn't touch it. As he stretches it, it just heals itself. And they go into a rage. They become angered because of what Christ has done. Because in a sense, he has made a mockery of them and what they think is important. And they want to see what they can do to Jesus in verse 11. Now we see in these two stories that their purpose, their joint purpose, is very easy to understand. In Mark chapter 2, verse 27, we see a good representation where it says that the Sabbath was made for man, not the man made for Sabbath. But I want to read to you the NLT version because it teases it out a little bit better. Check this out. It says, "The Sabbath was made to meet the needs of the people." They needed rest. And not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. See how it spells it out a little bit more. We see Jesus in the second Sabbath story who asked this question, what is lawful to do the Sabbath, on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? And I think you guys know the answer, don't you? Good or evil? Good. Right? Absolutely. It's lawful to do good. I'm reminded of what the Pharisee turned Christian Paul said when he said in Romans chapter 12, verse 9, love must be sincere. When we love, we're supposed to love sincerely. We see these Pharisees, and they're not really loving sincerely, are they? He continues, he says, hate what is evil, cling to what is good. We see Jesus in this story doing good because he feeds the disciples when they're hungry, because he heals a man who is sick. And we see on the flip side, the Pharisees do evil in their nitpicking and in their desire to accuse Jesus when he does good. This question forces them, of course, to stay silent, because who in the world would defy Jesus with such a question? I believe that these Pharisees weren't even concerned with being right, just looking right. Jesus' words cut deep. And I think if we read them honestly, I think they do cut deep with us as well. What's he trying to convey here? First, it's important for us to understand that the word lawful, if you look there, is used 3 times. It's used 3 times. Check it out. He uses it first in verse 2. Actually, he doesn't, but the Pharisees do when they ask about why they're doing something unlawful. And then we see in verse 4 that Jesus responds by saying, well, hey, he ate what is lawful only for priests to eat. And then he calls himself the Son of Man, the Lord of the Sabbath, who says what's lawful. And then we see in this other Sabbath story, verse 9, that he asks what is lawful to do on the Sabbath. I think as he's asking this question, they've got the 39 things memorized. They're ready to raise their hand, you know, maybe you shouldn't harvest. Maybe you shouldn't thresh. Maybe you shouldn't even write. Did you know you can't write with permanent marker or permanent pen on the Sabbath? But simply just worrying about what is good or evil. That's what Jesus wants them to understand. And so for us today, I really want us to focus on the lawfulness of Jesus. Okay? Let's do that. Focus on the lawfulness of Jesus, because the lawfulness of Jesus means people come first. The lawfulness of Jesus means people come first. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, wait, God comes first. Well, let's first understand. I'm talking to a Christian group of people. And if we're all Christians, we understand God comes first, right? We understand that God comes first, that through Christ we come through Jesus. But sometimes we get mixed up in all the other things in this life, and we start to think about what can I do, what is right and wrong to do, and we start to forget that people come first. Okay? When my grandfather was in the twilight days of his life, I asked him what was his favorite verse, and he read this to me. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? You. To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with God. Sometimes we miss the humble part, don't we? When Jesus is before a crowd, he's asked by a young man, what's the greatest command in the law? To which Christ answers in Matthew chapter 22, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. So let's remember, of course, God is first. Then he says this is the first and greatest command, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And he says these 2 things, all the law, all the prophets hang on these 2 commands. So that if you don't love God or you don't love your neighbor, I don't care what law you got that makes you as strict or scrupulous or the most rigid person in the world that you can take and boast in those things, if you do not love God or love your neighbor, it doesn't even matter. It might as well be on the floor. It means nothing. The law hangs upon loving God and neighbor. So yes, God comes first. But when we're talking about Christian brothers and sisters who understand this, who create all kinds of rules and things like that, we need to remember neighbors come first. People come first. Jesus simplifies the Sabbath for these people by saying, what's lawful to do on the Sabbath? Good or evil? Right or wrong? In your faith, you should never get to a point where you have a nitpicking nature like the Pharisees. You should have a humble walk with God. And understand that Jesus has freed you to be that way. When I think about Christian behavior, I cannot help but think of Romans chapter 12. It's one of the most convicting parts, I feel, for me personally, in Romans, when Paul writes in the 10th verse, be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourself. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Every step of the way, Paul is saying, for Christians, other people come before ourselves. People come first. And we call that sacrifice. You know, I once heard about a guy who opened his eyes and he saw right before him that there was this real glorious looking man before him. And he was a little off put. And the man just straight up asked him, he said, have you ever done anything of particular merit? He said, well, I can think of one thing, you know. Once I came upon a gang of high testosterone bikers who were threatening a young woman. And I directed them to leave her alone, but they would not listen, so I approached the largest and most heavily tattooed biker. He had him all over his face and his ears, and I smacked him on the head, and I kicked his bike over. I ripped out his nose ring, I threw it on the ground, and I said, you leave her alone or you're going to deal with me. When he said that, everything became unclouded, and he saw St. Peter before him. He said, when did that happen? He said, a couple of minutes ago. Sometimes when we sacrifice, we think, oh, it's going to lead to an altercation. And sometimes it can lead to an altercation or something difficult. As Christians, we need to be prepared for that because we will be persecuted because of the name of Jesus when we do this. But it's not all the time, especially not in the United States. And we need to be careful because sometimes, I've seen this more often than not as a teacher, that when an altercation happens, it's not because they're thinking of someone else. It's because they're thinking of themselves. They're thinking of their image. They're thinking of what people think of them. They're tied up pridefully in something. Jesus' example is people first. He feeds his disciples. He heals the man. He dies for you on the cross. He's whipped. He's mocked. He died for you. Can we just let that sink in for a moment? The creator of the heavens and earth over 6 days, who rested on the seventh day, who created everything through the Word, Jesus Christ, sent his Son, the Word, the nexus point by which all creation came about, to die for you, to give you Sabbath rest that you have never will ever see in any other way. we are called to be like Jesus. I've been blessed in my life that I've got to see many examples of people who are thinking of others first. And I know that when I say some of these, you're going to be like, I've seen that, or I've done that. I was talking with my parents on the way up to Colorado Springs to be at my uncle's funeral. And we were talking about this, and one of the things that came up was my grandpa Hurst and the fact that about once a month he would give up 2 to 3 hours on a Sunday afternoon of Sabbath, of the Sunday, to go and bring communion to people who could not go to church. I know that there are people in here who were raised in churches where they did that. Sometimes the sacrifice makes you have to put some of your normal Christian activities on hold. For example, Wednesday night church. For my family, when we were at Westworth, a new family started coming to our church, and they were awesome, but they had not been to church in decades. I'm talking about the mother and father, and their children had no church upbringing whatsoever. And they came up to me one day after church and said, "We need help." And I said, "What's up?" We would like a study or something. I said, "Great. You can come to church on Wednesday night." And they said, "Well, our kids, if you've noticed, they have a hard time paying attention." I said, "Okay, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. You pick a day." "Well, I can't because my work. I really can't. I'm working. I own my own business all the time. I'm on call, and that would not work, and it would not be good for you. The only day I can do it is Wednesday night." I said, "Okay." And so I sat down with one of the elders. I told him the situation. And we went through Gene Shelburne's, not all of it, because it's lengthy, it's good, but their family Bible study with that family. We ate, we studied, we played. I saw a group of people from our church give up a Monday morning last week. 7:15 a.m. to about 10 o'clock, feeding the staff at Olson Park Elementary. People come first. It's not easy. The lawfulness of Jesus, of people being first, is not always easy, because let's be honest, what is easy is me first, isn't it? It's so easy to be me first. It's so easy not to pick up the phone, not to open the door, pretend, oh, no one's home. It is so easy to be me first. And yet when I look at one of the most powerful parables by Jesus Christ about the Good Samaritan, I see the Levite and I see the priest. And this one hits me hard. The Levite and the priest walk on the other side of the road from this man who has been robbed and almost killed. And the reason is because they want to work in the church service. Because they want to be clean so that when they get to the temple, they can be used. They are uplifting ordinances above the decency of having compassion for someone who has been beaten within an inch of their life. Then the Samaritan comes, he puts him on a donkey, takes him to an inn and pays for everything. Which one is merciful? Jesus asks. We know the answer. About people first, John, the one whom Jesus loves, says, this is how we know what love is. You know what he's going to say? This is how we know what love is because of all the good things I've done. Nope. He says, this is how we know what love is. Get ready for it. Jesus Christ laid down His life for us, for you and I. That's how we know the love of God. And He says, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. See, people first. And then He says, if anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or a sister in need but has no pity on them, How can the love of God be in that person? Think about that for a moment. If Jesus Christ, if you believe in Jesus and you love Jesus, He's the Lord and Master of your life, the love of God determines the things you do. People come first. Dear children, he says, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. And we need to understand something. The Pharisees, you know the difference between the Pharisees and us in this verse? Because they could make really flowery words. They were good in prayers. Their speeches were great. They had a lot of good actions because they knew they were being seen. Well, look at that last word, to do it in truth. Never, ever sacrifice truth. I'll say that one more time. Never, ever sacrifice truth in the midst of people first. Jesus gives us a powerful example here that we have looked at today. And as Christians, we should be like Jesus, shouldn't we? Church, should we be like Jesus? Yes. One more time. Church, should we be like Jesus? Absolutely. We should be like Jesus, who healed on the Sabbath, who fed on the Sabbath, whose body was buried on the Sabbath, and then whose body came back up on the Sabbath, who created a new kind of Sabbath for you and I so we can live life in a new birth, in the presence of God, in a way that affects everybody through Jesus Christ in a new life. Let's embrace good. Let's embrace life. Through our faith in Jesus, let's remember the things we do to worship God never happen at the expense of loving people. You know, it's very easy if you're hearing this. That's a works-based lesson, Nathan. That's not what I'm advocating for. The Pharisees forgot the true purpose of the Sabbath. And like that, Christians can never forget the purpose of the cross. I want you to think about that for a moment. You cannot forget the purpose of the cross. Jesus Christ saved you for a purpose. Several years ago, my cousin came to the house. We always played. Okay, we loved playing, and we loved Star Wars, so we were doing Force and and all that kind of stuff. And one time he came and visited, and you know what he brought with him? He brought with him 2 action figures. I think one is Darth Maul, and one of them was probably Qui-Gon Jinn. He gave them to me. I was like, oh, sweet, thanks. He's like, yeah. And I put them in a drawer. He's like, you're not going to... He was like 5. He wanted to play with them now, with me. I said, no, I'm going to keep them because they might be worth something in a few decades or whatever. A few years passed by, I'm looking through the garage, and I open up the Tupperware, and there they are. Someone had broken the seal and played with them. Now, I have my suspicions. And I was mad at first. But then I realized they're toys. They're meant to be played with. Jesus did not save you to stick you in a Tupperware or in a drawer and close it so that you would not see the light of day. My prayer for you, church, is when you leave here, and right now, if it hasn't happened, that seal be opened for you, and the Spirit of God would move you and change you, so that even if it's the first time, all the things that you do for your faith, you realize are because of the one who rose on a Sunday. And that he died for you so that you could be good. In Ephesians, Paul writes, you are God's handiwork. Everybody here is God's handiwork. He has made you. It says He created you in Christ Jesus. So you're not only just knitted together in your mother's womb, you are created in Christ Jesus. He says to do good works, which God prepared in advance for you to do. So let's be a people who are known not as the people who have to keep all the rules, though they do good at that, but they're the people, man. Have you heard of the Christians? They helped my brother last week. That's what we want to be known for, as the people who follow Jesus, who died on the cross for the good of people. I hope that makes sense. I pray that goes with you this week. And as you take it, you let the Spirit work on you. And you open your eyes. And you allow the Spirit to speak to you and help you think of people first.